welcome back to Live from Paris this afternoon on France 24. The headlines for you at 2:30. Iraq's Prime Minister says he will resign following bloodshed yesterday. At least 45 protesters shot dead on Thursday. Demonstrations, though, resuming today. At least 3 more people reported killed in the city of Nasiriyah. A 12-day siege at a Hong Kong university comes to an end. Police ending the blockade, saying they've uncovered thousands of explosives on campus. Most demonstrators holed up have now been arrested or managed to escape. And a global march for climate justice. Thousands taking to the streets around the world to demand their leaders take radical action ahead of a major climate summit next week. First, Iraq's Prime Minister has announced he intends to resign. Adel Abdul Mahdi said Parliament now needed to select a new government in the wake of bloodshed yesterday. On Thursday, at least 45 people were shot dead by security forces, making it one of the most violent days since protests began almost 2 months ago. Well, speaking before the Prime Minister's announcement, the powerful Shia cleric Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani called on lawmakers to reconsider their support for his government. Meanwhile, today, protests have resumed despite the violence, and 3 people have been reported killed in the city of Nasiriyah. Well, for more now, we can talk to our diplomatic affairs editor, Mark Perelman, who is on set with me. Mark, first of all, just give us your thoughts on the resignation of the Prime Minister just hours after we heard those comments from the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani.
Yes, the writing was on the wall as soon as the Grand Ayatollah spoke in very clear terms about the need for a new government. He had already issued a few warnings since the violence began on October 1st, leading to over 400 dead and counting. But today, clearly, he said we need to change government. And we knew the Prime Minister was about to resign. The only question was when. And he announced today through a statement that he will formally submit his resignation to Parliament after a year only in power, and after it took months for all the coalition blocs to agree on his name. And so clearly this is a new era of uncertainty, and it's a likelihood that a new compromise candidate will take a long time to emerge, because clearly what has happened has rattled all the political elite in Iraq, and no one can tell today what will happen next.
You say no one can tell what will happen next, but give us a sense of what you think will happen in the streets. Is this likely to quell some of that anger that we've seen for 2 months now?
Well, the initial reports, and those are very early reports, there were some scenes of joy in Tahrir Square in Baghdad, which was clearly one of the symbolic places for this protest movement that has been there for several weeks. What's really interesting is that a lot of the unrest came from Shia strongholds, and a lot of unrest was also directed against Iran. And so clearly this is a setback for Iran. The Prime Minister was seen as favorable to Iran. He was also seen as someone the West, and first and foremost the US, could deal with. But we've seen protests directed against Shia party and Shia militias aligned with Tehran. So clearly this is not a good sign for Tehran. We saw the consulate in Najaf being assaulted just a couple of days ago, and it was not the first time. The question is whether Iran will be able to wield its influence for the next prime minister. And clearly this will be a battleground behind the scenes, hopefully, and not in the streets, between Washington and Tehran. And who will win is not likely to be a compromise candidate between both capitals, like it has been the case with this prime minister and the 2 previous ones.
All right, Mark, and just very briefly, it is your sense then that this is likely to be quite a drawn-out process to select a new prime minister.
Yes, it could be. I mean, we've seen this happen in Lebanon, and it takes weeks because there's a political deadlock, and there's no clear majority, and there's unrest in the street, and social demands have to be met. And so it's a social, economic, political crisis. You put all this together in a region where there's a lot of turmoil, and it's impossible just with a magic wand to find a very quick and easy solution.
Mark Perelman, our diplomatic affairs editor, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis on the programme on that breaking news that Iraq's Prime Minister has announced his resignation this afternoon. Let's move on now, though, and bring you some other world news, because police in Hong Kong have meanwhile ended their 12-day blockade of a university campus there. For nearly 2 weeks, Hong Kong Polytechnic had become the site of a fierce standoff between activists and the police. The activists, armed with bricks and petrol bombs, attacked police lines during the siege. But during the past week, most protesters were arrested or managed to escape, leaving the campus largely empty. With more details, here's Andrew Hillier.
The cordon has finally come down, but it could take months to restore Hong Kong's Polytechnic University to what it was. 12 days of running battles have left the campus looking more like a battlefield, with broken glass and barricades making it unrecognisable. It was here and the surrounding streets that saw some of the most violent protests in nearly 6 months of unrest.
The campus was left in ruins and covered in bricks, glass fragments and debris. No one single building or even one single floor was spared from the damage.
Officers say they found an arsenal of weapons, including around 4,000 petrol bombs, more than 1,300 explosive objects, and these, bows and arrows. It took them a day to remove everything that had been left behind by protesters. More than 1,000 of them had tried to hold out against police. Some slipped through the cordon, but officers say they arrested more than 800 of them and recorded the details of 300 under-18s who could end up facing charges later. The end of the blockade has ushered in an unusual period of calm, but it's unlikely to last. At lunchtime, protesters held a flash mob protest, chanting pro-democracy slogans. Activists have already called for more rallies to be held in the coming days, urging demonstrators to keep up the momentum.
To Sudan now, where a law has been passed dissolving the party of the ousted former president Omar al-Bashir. The legislation aims at dismantling the remnants of Bashir's regime and eradicating corruption. His party, the NCP, has today branded the move intellectually bankrupt. Meanwhile, the current government has also repealed a controversial law that was used by Bashir's regime to regulate what women do and how women dress. Yenna Lee has more for us now on the significance of changing that law.
For almost 3 decades under Omar al-Bashir's regime, a public order law effectively clamped down on civil liberties. Women were the main targets of this legislation. Hundreds of thousands of them have been prosecuted, such as this activist who wishes to remain anonymous. She was sentenced to 100 lashes in 2010 for drinking alcohol.
Flogging destroys you inside. I became a more violent person. I would get mad and break things. These changes within me happened because I was a victim of violence.
Article 152 of the country's Criminal Act states that indecent acts, obscene outfits or anything contrary to public morals in a public place is punishable with flogging, a fine or both. Born out of conservative Islamic social codes, the law de facto imposed a dress code on women and restricted their social lives, education and careers.
We have a lot of systemic violence against women that's aimed at limiting their participation in political and social life. We have laws that encourage law enforcement to perpetrate violence against women.
The head of the civilian-led cabinet, Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, described the law as a tool of exploitation and humiliation. By repealing it, his government is putting into action some of the reformist policies it had promised. For women's activists in Sudan, it's just the first step of many to achieve gender equality.
2 French army helicopters that crashed in Mali earlier this week had not been under fire from Islamic State jihadists. That's been confirmed today by the French Chief of Army Staff. On Thursday, Islamic State in West Africa had claimed responsibility for the incident without providing any evidence. 13 French soldiers died when the helicopters collided near the border with Burkina Faso on Monday. It was the highest loss of life by French forces in a single day since the 1980s, and a national tribute for the soldiers will be held here in Paris next week. To Italy now, where police say they've uncovered a plot to form a new Nazi party. Officers raided 19 homes throughout the country, seizing a cache of weapons. Police describe those involved as being united by anti-Semitism and xenophobia. For more, let's talk to our correspondent Seema Gupta, who's been covering this story for us from Rome. Seema, first of all, the police had been investigating this group for the past 2 years. Tell us what they've uncovered.
Yes, I mean, it was a 2-year-long investigation, as you put it, and 19 people are now being investigated. Their homes have been raided. They're not in custody, but they are being investigated, and they range in 16 different towns, all the way from Milan to Sicily. So it's across the length of Italy. And as you mentioned, they're being accused of trying to form this pro-Nazi, anti-Semitic, xenophobic party that they call the Italian National Socialist Workers' Party. Now, the authorities found a cache of automatic weapons, rifles, swords, as well as plaques and flags with images of swastikas, as well as images of Hitler and Mussolini in these homes. There were also pamphlets insulting Jewish as well as other political leaders in Italy. So clearly they were trying to create an organization. They said that they recruited members on social media and even created a closed chat group entitled Militia, in which they were training them. Now, Italian media has reported that some of the members include a former member of the Calabrian mafia organization, the 'Ndrangheta. There was even a 48-year-old woman who called herself the Sergeant Major to Hitler, and a 26-year-old woman who was allegedly part of a Miss Hitler beauty contest online. So really an interesting group of people, but some really interesting stories coming out of this investigation, which has caused quite a stir in terms of the media reaction, as well as locals in general, that there could be such an organization here in Italy.
Yeah, and there's been a suggestion, hasn't there, Seema, that the group was trying to forge contacts with extremists elsewhere in Europe. What do we know about those possible links?
Well, the authorities are saying that they had some contacts with groups in Britain, as well as Portugal in particular. And one member was said to have spoken at a meeting held in Lisbon. So really interesting contacts within Europe. And of course, concern, because let's not forget, looking at Italy's dark past, could we see a resurgence of that? Because, of course, fascism was really, Italy is the birthplace of fascism in Europe. And so are we seeing a resurgence of this idea? Back in 1952, though, there was a law in place, and it's on those grounds that these people have been taken in for investigation. That law forbade the formation of a Nazi party. The concern now is, though, why is there such a group being created? Could it possibly in some way be linked to the fact that for about a year or so, we had a far-right party that was in power, the League Party in government, that's no longer there, but it was there. And perhaps that has given them some kind of sense of strength to be able to form such a grouping. Concern as well as relief, I think, for many, that at least the authorities and the security services have clamped down on this particular group, and they are going to be continuing their investigations.
Seema Gupta, live for us in Rome this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for taking us through the details in that case. Next, demonstrations are taking place in cities across the world today to demand governments take radical action to combat global warming. The rallies have been called to pile pressure on leaders ahead of climate negotiations to be held in Madrid next week. Now, those negotiations are expected to focus on the sharp divide between richer polluting nations and developing countries. So far today, protests have been held in Tokyo, Manila, Berlin and Paris, to name just a few. Some of the biggest marches began life in Australia. Catherine Bennett has been taking a look at the developments there.
We will rise! We will rise!
Chanting protesters picketed the offices of Australia's ruling Conservative Party on Friday to demand action on climate change. It kicks off a day of global protest.
We're here to demand climate action. People have lost their homes, people have lost their lives. We have to ask, how far does this have to go before our government finally takes action?
Australia has been devastated by hundreds of bushfires in recent weeks. The Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has insisted there is no link between climate change and the increasing severity of the fires.
Earlier this year, my hometown was on the front lines of the Bunyip bushfires, and I guess that kind of shocked me into realising that this is something that is happening and it's time I do something about it.
The Fridays for Future protest is a global movement spearheaded by Swedish climate change campaigner Greta Thunberg. School children and activists all over the world skip school and work on Fridays to raise awareness of the climate crisis. The demonstrations come ahead of next week's COP25 climate conference in Madrid, where world leaders will meet to finalise the 2015 Paris Climate Treaty, due to come into force in 2021. Scientists have warned that the Earth is heading towards a global tipping point and that we are in a planetary emergency. If temperatures continue to rise at the current pace, some parts of the planet will become uninhabitable.
Now, today is Black Friday. Once primarily simply an American retail phenomenon, it's now becoming increasingly exported abroad. Here in France, for example, the cut price shopping day is becoming more and more popular, as James Vecina found out.
A once-in-a-lifetime deal or a well-crafted scam? Black Friday has been crossing borders in the last years, and 2019 is set to be another global spending spree. Over in the United States, where many start their Christmas shopping, Americans are expected to drop a whopping $7 billion on the day. Money quickly spent, but last year over half of customers ended up regretting their purchase. Consumer organisations are denouncing the pressure advertising's putting on customers, with sales no different than in the rest of the year. In France, where clothing, high-tech and beauty products fly off the shelves, one group found that an average of only 7.5% of items were on sale. The biggest retail day for Amazon, as the online company employs 10,000 extra workers for the end-of-year sales. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, many studied products were shown to be cheaper before and after Black Friday. The groups are advising shoppers to do their research before they buy. But Black Friday doesn't end there. The spending continues with Cyber Monday.